All right, I've gotten several requests today from people asking me what I thought about the NAR ruling that happened today. NAR is the National Association of Realtors, and they are named in a lawsuit along with Keller Williams and Homeservices of America, which is part of Berkshire Hathaway. So these three defendants have been named as part of a lawsuit where a lot of sellers have basically accused those three entities of inflating sales prices by colluding together to control commissions and to pay buyers agents commissions from the seller's pocket, basically. So I felt like this shirt would be appropriate. I feel like we need less government, so I decided to put this shirt on and record this video. All right, so with that backdrop, here's what I think it means, and here's what I think will happen going forward. So, number one, I would say that the sellers sign listing agreements with listing agents, and then the listing agent decides what to do with that money. So, typically, it's somewhere between 5 and 6% that the commission is to sell a home. That is an agreement between the seller and the listing agent. Now, the listing agent decides to put that on the MLS, which is a marketing platform. It's a multiple listing service. So we put that on that marketing platform that other agents can also see that listing, and we agree to cooperate with the other agents in that group. We agree to share our commission with other agents in that group, and then we can decide as the listing agent what commission, what percentage that other agent gets. Almost every time we split it half and half. So if it's a 6% commission on the listing, then the listing agent keeps 3% and the buyer's side gets 3%. So that's what the listing agreement is. Okay. So the seller is not actually paying the buyer's agent. The seller has agreed to pay the listing agent the 6% or whatever commission was negotiated. A lot of times that is 6%. Sometimes it's 5%. Sometimes it's 10%. And sometimes it's a flat fee. We've had all of those show up in our past, depending on who the listing agent is. And if I'm the buyer's agent, I've worked for as little as 1% before. I've also worked for as much as 5%, and I got half and the other guy got half, so it was a 10% commission. And then I've recently done a flat fee. So it really depends on the situation, and it depends on really what needs to be negotiated. So our selling North Georgia standard listing percentage is 6%. There are other agents in our town that the standard is 5%, and there's even one agent in our town that the standard is 4%. There are discount brokerages where they can put it on the MLS for like $295 They'll put it on the MLS for you. Now, as the homeowner, you have to do the showings and you have to put the lockbox and the signs up, and you have to do all those things. But for that minimal fee, they'll put it on the MLS. So there are a lot of different ways to list your house. And if you don't want to list your house with a realtor, you can go for sell by owner. You can put it for sell by owner sign in the yard. You can put it on Zillow, which functions as a residential MLS these days. So, as a matter of fact, I went and looked at a house earlier today that was for sale by owner, and he was offering 0 commission. He did not want to pay me a commission no matter what. And so, if I get paid on that house, the buyer's going to have to pay me the commission. So that exists already, and you don't have to use an agent. So I'm a little confused by the ruling that happened today. Every seller that is a plaintiff, and I think there are 260,000 of them. Every plaintiff that was in that room or was represented in that room, all of them signed an agreement with a listing agent knowing what the listing percentage was, and they didn't have to sign that listing agreement. They could have worked with any of the people I just mentioned that charge 5 or 10 or $295 or whatever it may be. So I'm confused as to why the contract that was signed is not valid, because the ruling today essentially rules that those contracts are not valid. So that's a slippery slope. If we decide that those contracts are no longer valid, what other contracts are not valid anymore? I think it's a very slippery slope. So I think that's a good segue to tell you where I think this thing is going. So obviously, Keller Williams will likely appeal. Homeservices of America will appeal. NAR will certainly appeal. I think they've already said as much. So I think all this is going to get appealed. It's going to go to the next level, then to the next level, then to the next level. So they'll keep, arguing back and forth until this thing goes to the Supreme Court. That is likely where this thing ends up because there are somewhere around 1.5 million realtors that are part of NAR, National Association of Realtors. So anytime there's a million people represented in some form or fashion, then you got the other, 260,000 plaintiffs. So there's a couple million people that are affected by this, and it's not the only lawsuit. This is the first one that got a jury to deliberate and find a verdict, but there are other ones coming. So there's several million people that are going to be affected by this. I can't imagine that this does not end up at the Supreme Court. So I think that's where this ends up. I think the Supreme Court will uphold the right of people to sign contracts and then live up to those contracts. It's likely where the Supreme Court lands. So I expect this to be a whole bunch of nothing by the end of it. Now, what could happen, one of these brokerages like this one could actually decide, hey, we're going to change our policy. This is how we're going to do business from now on. That changing of the policy may be that they say, hey, we're gonna list everything at 3%, and that is our company policy. Berkshire, you can do whatever you want. Remax, you can do whatever you want. EXP, the rest of you guys do whatever you want. Our internal policy is we're going to list it at 3%, and buyers are on your own. I think ultimately that's bad for buyers. I think that's bad for the public market. I think that if you depend on someone who buys a home once every 5 or 6 or 7 years to know how to transact and know how to do it well and know how to avoid some of the pitfalls that you get into, I think that's a net loss for the buyer. Do house prices come down because now it's only 3% instead of 6% to list a home and sell a home? Maybe slightly. I don't think it helps the market any, really. I really think what happens are, for example, if you work with us, we're going to sell somewhere around 150 to 180 houses this year. So I've had the opportunity to negotiate 150 times on a sale of a house this year. And if you're a buyer, it's likely this is the first time you've gotten the opportunity to negotiate. So just from sheer numbers alone, forget about talent or anything else. Just the fact that I've already done it 150 times this year, and you're going to try to negotiate with me the first time, like that's a pretty tough position to put yourself in as a buyer. So I think as a buyer, you want to have representation. So now the question becomes, okay, the buyer has to have their own representation and they have to pay for it. It's already hard enough to find buyers that have 20% down or 15 or 10% down. With the price of homes the way they are today, a starter home at $300,000, if you're going to have 10% down, that's $30,000 you got to come up with out of pocket. So if you're going to do 10% down and you're going to pay the agent that you're working with the 2.5% or 3%, or let's say you're a great negotiator and you got that agent down to 2%. Well, 2% of 300,000, that's still a lot of money, right? You got to add that on top of the 10% down. And you better be a really good negotiator and get that seller to pay closing costs too. And if you're going up against an agent that's experienced and they can show you that most people don't pay closing costs, well, now you're going to have to pay closing costs too. So you got 40, 50 grand out of pocket to buy this $300,000 starter home. That's not good for the market. I think you guys know that. I think you realize that this could be really bad for the buyers. So I just don't think it's going to be wise for this to continue down this road and them to, the courts to uphold the decision of this jury. I think it's a bad move. We shall see, though. If it does happen, then the Selling North Georgia team will certainly adjust and we will become great listing agents. And we will probably also have some buyer representation as well. How we charge for that might be hourly, might be on a percentage basis. There are lots of things to figure out. I think it's probably going to take years to get to the Supreme Court, so we're probably at minimum 12 months away from it, but we're probably more likely 24 to 36 months away from actually knowing what's going to happen here. So I would say to all my agent friends, just go to work tomorrow and pretend as if this hasn't even happened. That's how agents need to handle it. As far as buyers go, technically you're not having any money come out of pocket to pay for these buyers agents right now, so utilize that. Go find a buyer agent to work with that will represent you and not just work with the listing agent, because there is value in having an agent represent your side of this transaction. So go find that buyer's agent while you still can. They may go away shortly, or they may cost you more. So hopefully you can go ahead and go get one of those. If you're on the selling side and you're going to list a house soon, then I would say maybe you can wait and only pay 3% in a couple of years instead of 6. I think the buyer pool is going to get a lot smaller first before we figure this whole thing out and understand how it's going to affect the transaction. So I would say in a moment of uncertain times, that's probably not the right time to sell. Uncertainty usually doesn't do well for the market. So you want certainty. And so far, this has worked for the last 100 years. So there's some certainty in that. And I think wishing for the uncertain times, probably a mistake if you're a seller. Right now, the listing agent is going to represent you and is going to share their money with somebody else. That's a good place to be. The buyer doesn't have to come up with extra money. It's really good for you, the seller. And ultimately, let's be honest, the buyer is actually the one paying the commission. Like, if you really follow the money, the buyer is the one paying the commission. The seller owns the asset, and the seller is selling that asset, and maybe the money comes off of the proceeds of the asset sale. But really, where does the money come from? The money comes from the buyer and the bank. So really, the seller's not even paying the commission at all. So yeah, I guess it depends on your perspective. But as I look at these settlement statements and I see who brings the money to closing, that's who's paying the fee. It's actually not the seller. So those are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. Talk to you soon.